War has always been a matter of death and power, but in the ancient East, it was also a matter of gods. Long before gunpowder, when kings claimed descent from stars and monks held silence like a sword, two great spiritual traditions emerged: Hinduism and Buddhism, both born in the cradle of India, both whispering of peace, order, and liberation. And yet, both found their way to the battlefield. In the hymns of the Vedas and the verses of the Mahabharata, warriors were not mere men. They were agents of cosmic balance. Slaughter, when done in dharma, became sacred. To kill with righteousness was not to sin, it was to fulfill divine duty. In Buddhism, peace reigned at the core, but in kingdoms ruled by emperors cloaked in compassion, violence still burned beneath the robe. When invaders desecrated temples, even monks picked up blades. And when power corrupted kings, rebels prayed with one hand and struck with the other. This is the forgotten face of spiritual warfare, not crusades of conquest, but of karma and balance, where every battle cried out to heaven, and the gods did not always answer with silence. Part 1. Dharma and Destruction. When gods walked with armies, the battlefield was silent, yet heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers. The sun had not yet risen, but the earth already trembled. Kurukshetra was no ordinary plain. It was destined. The armies stood in formation, row after row of armored men breathing as one, their fingers tightening around spears and bows. Across the field stood their kin, their teachers, their friends. Today they would be enemies. Today Dharma would demand blood. At the heart of it all, Arjuna stood still on his chariot, his hand refusing to lift his bow. The warrior who had never known fear now found himself paralyzed, not by cowardice, but by conscience. His soul recoiled from what was to come, and beside him, holding the reins, stood Krishna, not merely a charioteer, but the god Vishnu in mortal form. What he spoke in that moment would echo beyond empires and centuries. You must fight, not for revenge, not for hatred, but because it is your dharma, your sacred duty. With those words, the Bhagavad Gita was born, a divine dialogue between man and God that turned the chaos of war into a question of spiritual alignment. The Gita did not glorify violence, it sanctified it. It transformed killing into sacrifice, blood into offering, and the battlefield into a cosmic theater where souls acted out their roles in the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. This was the essence of Hindu war culture. War was not merely political, it was metaphysical. The warrior, or kshatriya, was more than a soldier. He was a protector of order, a servant of the gods, a weapon in the hands of fate. To abandon battle was to abandon the universe's design. To fulfill one's duty was to walk the path of righteousness, even if it meant walking through fire. The ancient Vedic texts that preceded the Gita were filled with hymns to deities of thunder and war. Indra, the storm-wielding god, was praised for slaying demons and crushing fortresses. Agni, god of fire, was invoked to carry offerings to the heavens, and later, to consume the dead on the pyres of fallen heroes. The Rig Veda celebrated the conquest of chaos, the victory of order through divine violence. Sacrifice was sacred. The universe itself, according to Vedic myth, was born from the dismemberment of a primal being. Blood, then, was not filth. It was a thread that bound mortals to the gods. As Indian kingdoms evolved, the Mahabharata and Ramayana emerged, not only as epics, but as blueprints for power and purpose. Rama, the ideal king, waged war against the demon Ravana, not for conquest, but to restore moral balance. Arjuna's arrows did not simply kill, they liberated. Warriors purified themselves before battle, performed rituals, fasted, and prayed. A sword was not drawn in haste, it was drawn after mantra. The enemy, when vanquished, was cremated with honor. There were rules, there were lines, though drawn in blood. When Hinduism flowed eastward into Southeast Asia, it carried these values in stone and scripture. The Khmer Empire, rising from the jungles of Cambodia, built temples that mirrored the cosmic order. Angkor Wat, dedicated to Vishnu, was more than architecture. it was a weapon of legitimacy. Carvings on its walls depicted celestial battles, kings as divine avatars, and wars as sacred acts. In Java, kings claimed lineage from Arjuna or Shiva and waged campaigns with blessings from priests who whispered verses into bowls of fire before each march. Across these kingdoms, war was never just about land. It was about cosmic alignment. Rituals were as critical as strategies. Before battle, Brahmin priests conducted fire sacrifices to invoke divine favor. Warriors carried talismans etched with sacred syllables. Some painted their bodies with ash and sandalwood, invoking Hanuman or Durga for strength. The battlefield became an altar, and death was the price of communion. Yet amid this divine firestorm, a different voice emerged. A prince named Siddhartha, born into the warrior caste, walked away from the palace and the sword. He sat beneath a tree, seeking not conquest but release. What he found was silence. Suffering, he said, was the root of all existence, and desire its cause. The path forward was not through victory, but through letting go. This was the origin of Buddhism. In its earliest teachings, Buddhism rejected violence outright. To kill was to accrue karma, to tie oneself further into the wheel of rebirth. Monks were to walk barefoot, eat only what was given, and harm no living being. Compassion, mindfulness, and detachment were the weapons of the enlightened. But the world, rarely silent, crept into even the most sacred spaces. When the Mauryan emperor Ashoka converted to Buddhism after the horrific Kalinga War, he vowed never to wage war again. Pillars bearing his edicts proclaimed peace, tolerance, and non-violence across his empire. Monks were sent across Asia. Temples rose where swords had fallen. For a time, the dream seemed real, but kingdoms do not survive on dreams alone. As Buddhism spread into Tibet, China, Korea, and Japan, it transformed. In each new land, it merged with local customs, needs, and realities. In Tibet, monks aligned with warrior nobles to preserve their monasteries. In Sri Lanka, Buddhist kings lead armies against Tamil invaders with banners bearing the wheel of dharma. In Thailand and Burma, monks blessed weapons and marched with troops to defend the faith against foreign threats. The teachings remained, but were bent to fit the blade. And then came the Sakai in medieval Japan, where rival clans turned the country into a battlefield. Buddhist monasteries evolved into political powers. Monks, once humble seekers of nirvana, now trained in warfare. The most feared were the warrior monks of Mount Hiei, guardians of the Tendai sect. They trained in silence, fought without hesitation, and wore black robes into battle. With naginatas in hand and sutras in their hearts, they defended their temples from samurai lords and rival sects alike. For them, the monastery was the kingdom, and faith was the fortress. They were not hypocrites, they were survivors. Their violence was cloaked, not in hate, but in necessity. They prayed for peace and prepared for war. In Buddhist philosophy, the bodhisattva chooses to remain in the world to help others achieve enlightenment. Some bodhisattvas, like Manjushri, were shown wielding flaming swords not to harm, but to cut through ignorance. Yet when the world is on fire, even symbols become literal. Even monks must choose which blade to carry. From Vedic kings to Japanese monks, from Khmer generals to Sri Lankan priests, the line between salvation and slaughter was never clear. Faith did not erase war, it redefined it. In the next chapter, we will descend even deeper into the everyday lives of soldiers and monks, into the fire rituals before battles, into the silent resistance that lingered long after the wars were over. We will uncover how entire cultures survived between prayer and the sword, and how even in peace, the ghosts of sacred wars refused to sleep. Part 2. The Monk, the Sword, and the Silent Battlefield. At the edge of a burned forest in 14th century Kyoto, silence reigned. Charred trees stretched like skeletal arms toward a slate-gray sky. Crows circled the embers of what had once been a monastery. The smell of incense still clung to the stones, sweet and stubborn against the stench of ash and blood. Among the ruins stood a single figure-shaven head, black robes tattered by wind, hands pressed in prayer. In his left sleeve, hidden from view, rested a curved blade. A monk, a warrior, a contradiction made flesh. This was not a tale of madness, it was devotion sharpened into resolve. The Buddhist Sai, born from centuries of unrest, were not monks in the tranquil sense. They chanted sutras, yes, but also trained in martial arts. They meditated at dawn and marched at dusk. Their monasteries held libraries of sacred texts and arsenals of war. When their faith was threatened by rival sects, imperial armies, or ambition, they did not beg. They bled. Mount Hiei, the seat of the Tendai sect, became their fortress. Its monks were trained from childhood to memorize scripture and wield the naginata. To be a warrior monk was to live with restraint and strike without hesitation. It was said that their chants could break the spirits of enemies before steel was ever drawn. But Japan was not alone in giving birth to faith-bound warriors. In the thick jungles of Southeast Asia, Khmer warriors prayed to Vishnu before battle, daubing their skin with sacred ash and chanting the names of gods etched into the stone of Angkor's temples. They believed that a blade, when wielded in dharma, could become an extension of the divine. Battles began not with trumpet calls, but with ritual, offerings to ancestors, sacrifices to the spirits of the land. Warriors were not just soldiers, they were instruments of celestial justice. In India, the Rajputs upheld a code that blurred heroism and martyrdom. Descended from the Kshatriya caste, they saw combat as both duty and salvation. Before riding into hopeless battles, they performed jahar, a ritual of collective self-immolation by the women of the fort, to preserve honor from the enemy. It was a horror cloaked in glory. The men rode out knowing they would die. They rode out chanting hymns, faces streaked with vermilion, invoking Kali or Shiva to witness their final hour. Every war, every skirmish, was a stage for cosmic theater. Across Asia, soldiers carried more than weapons. They carried mantras, charms, icons of gods tucked beneath armor. In the Lana kingdom of northern Thailand, warriors tied white threads around their arms, blessed by monks to deflect arrows. Before battle, they poured holy water onto their blades, not to clean them, but to consecrate them. When they killed, they did not see murder, they saw purification. This spiritualization of violence was not born from bloodlust. It emerged from a deep fear that chaos was always waiting, that without divine order, the world would fall to darkness. And so war became a ritual to keep that darkness at bay. A brutal, sacred act performed with reverence and fire. But fire consumes indiscriminately. In Tibet, where Buddhism rose high into the mountains, monks carried prayer wheels and butter lamps through snowbound villages. Peace was their purpose. And yet, when Mongol invasions swept across the plateau, some sects allied with khans and warlords to preserve their monasteries. Others took up arms themselves. The sacred texts did not always forbid violence. Some scriptures spoke of wrathful deities, guardians of the dharma, who wielded weapons and crushed demons beneath their heels. These deities, painted in swirling colors with fangs and flame halos, were not metaphors. They were invoked. They were believed, and when monks trained in the arts of debate and silence felt their survival threatened, they became those guardians. The contradiction deepened. The Buddhist Vinaya, a foundational code for monks, forbade killing, and yet in Burma, Sri Lanka, and Japan, kings who claimed a rule by Buddhist virtue led invasions, sieges, and purges. They built stupas on battlefields. They ordered the recitation of suttas before campaigns. They donated land to monasteries with one hand and raised enemy temples with the other. Buddhist monks and Hindu priests alike became tools of statecraft. Their blessings lent legitimacy to conquest. Their rituals opened the gates of war. But not all followed blindly. There were those who resisted, who spoke against the fusion of faith and violence. In 5th century India, a Buddhist monk named Buddhaghosa wrote of the dangers of ego and bloodshed. In ancient Lanka, a monk tried to dissuade King Duttagamunu from celebrating war, reminding him that the slain were human, not demons. The king wept, then declared temples in their honor. In Vietnam, amid the shadows of Kompa's fallen towers, Hindu kings once built temples to Shiva, but inscribed warnings into stone that those who wielded violence unjustly would be reborn as slaves to their victims. The echoes of resistance were faint, often drowned beneath the roar of conquest, but they were there, in whispered mantras, in the eyes of monks who refused to bless armies, in the silence that followed the clash of blades. Meanwhile, the common people endured the consequences of sacred wars. They were the ones who fed the soldiers, patched their wounds, buried their dead. In villages where armies passed, food was hidden beneath floorboards. Children were taught to recite prayers for protection, not from demons, but from men. Farmers left offerings at crossroads, not to honor the gods, but to beg that no armies return. And when peace came, it came in fragments. In burned temples, monks recopied texts with shaking hands. In ruined shrines, priests relit the sacred flame with ashes still warm from war. Survivors performed purification rituals not to remove sin, but to convince the gods to return. They spoke of a time when swords would rust and mantras would once again be heard without the cry of death beside them. But history marched on. The blend of Hinduism and Buddhism with warfare created legacies that outlived the kingdoms they served. The idea of the sacred warrior, of violence guided by spiritual law, found echoes in samurai code, in nationalist movements, in modern politics disguised as tradition. Even today, amulets are worn by soldiers in Southeast Asia. Holy men bless military vehicles. Chanting is heard before gunfire. The ghosts of ancient wars still breathe beneath the surface, because once war is made sacred, it cannot be easily unsanctified. We look back and wonder how religions of peace came to walk so often with death. But the answer is not in the doctrine, it's in the world they faced. A world where justice was fragile, where survival was never guaranteed, and where gods were asked to bless every blade drawn in their name. The monk and the warrior, the prayer and the sword. Two halves of a truth too painful to look at directly. So we tell stories, we remember, we mourn and mythologize, because buried beneath centuries of ash and scripture is the one truth no temple could erase. War, even when holy, still leaves blood on the altar. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history.